might get Gabrielle to do your introduction there, Dave, because I'm busy admitting people.
Okay. Gabrielle, did you hear that? Or I can just do it. I can just do it.
Yeah, take it away, Dave.
Yeah. I apologize for my dog. He's being very barky today, so we'll have a background entertainment. Do you want me to start, Gabrielle?
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. This is the third in a series of webinars that the New Brunswick Soil and Crop Improvement Association is hosting in collaboration with the Nova Scotia, Newfoundland and Labrador and PEI Soil and Crop Improvement Associations, or sorry, OFCAF groups, not Soil and Crop in the other provinces, it's OFCAF. And this week, so the first 2 weeks we did soil sampling, pH management, and now we're going to talk about nitrogen management, and that's what's near and dear to my heart. This session will qualifies for certified educational units, and here's the thing you have to scan in your agrologist app to get credit for viewing this session. I'm going to show this at the end of the session as well, so if you miss it, it will come back up for your viewing pleasure. As I said, nitrogen is near and dear to my heart. I've spent my career studying it, and I've talked to you about it many times. So some of this material I'm going to talk about today you've seen before, and I apologize for that, but it is what it is. So what's the problem with nitrogen? Why is nitrogen so special? Well, it's special because it's a large amount is required by the crop, and it's very expensive. So we want to pay careful attention to nitrogen. It also has a significant environmental impact. But in terms of Atlantic Canada, some of the challenges that make nitrogen a little bit different from some of the other elements is that nitrogen is so dynamic. There's so many processes that can make it go away, and there's processes that can bring it into the system, and they're all driven by biology, and therefore that biology is influenced by climatic events. And so we have a very difficult cycle to manage. We also have some challenges that are more agronomic within Atlantic Canada. We have a relatively short growing season. We have a very high amount of precipitation, and that precipitation is becoming increasingly unpredictable. So that's challenging as well. As we talked about last week, the soils of our region are inherently of low fertility, and in large part because of the low pH and the low cation exchange capacity and % base saturation in their natural state. The declining organic matter content that we've observed over the last 30 or 40 years, resulting in a very low nitrogen use efficiency. And one of the things we want to do is use our nitrogen management to try to increase that nitrogen use efficiency, because the nitrogen is expensive and it has environmental impact. And those impacts include things like surface water impacts, groundwater impacts, greenhouse gas emissions. But I want to highlight that those environmental impacts are also indicators of a leaky nitrogen cycle, and that's what's causing our inefficiency. So in part, when we're trying to reduce those environmental impacts, we're also trying to increase the agronomic efficiency of nitrogen use. The other big problem we've had in Atlantic Canada is we have limited tools to inform, or we have had limited tools to inform nitrogen management. We did not have a soil nitrogen test that was routinely being used. We've now introduced one. And we've had limited nitrogen response calibration data, or at least limited recent nitrogen response calibration data, which complicates the understanding of how much nitrogen we actually need. So let's step back in a very broad level. Where does our nitrogen come from? Too often we think it only comes from the nitrogen fertilizer we apply. That's not the case. Only about half of what the crop takes up comes from nitrogen fertilizer. The other half comes from the soil nitrogen supply, which is the mineralization of soil organic matter, and or organic amendments or legume crops. And so it's important to remember the diversity of the various sources of nitrogen that provide the crop. Where does our nitrogen go? Well, we're aware of our crop harvest, which accounts again for about 50% of the nitrogen we removed. But there's this other series of pathways and whatnot: ammonia volatilization, denitrification, nitrate leaching, the immobilization of nitrogen and soil organic matter that account for that other 50% of nitrogen. So a significant amount of nitrogen is not going where we want it to. But there are opportunities as well. One of the nice things about our region is we still have a relatively diverse agricultural system, diverse cropping systems. In some regions of Canada, the cropping systems are much more monoculture or limited rotational basis, limiting the opportunities to build soil organic matter and diversify the nitrogen cycle in terms of including legumes and perennial crops. We also have a situation, at least in some provinces, where we still have a fairly significant amount of organic amendments like manure. Newfoundland in particular, organic nitrogen sources are the dominant sources of nitrogen. We do produce several high-value crops like potatoes, which is an opportunity in terms of revenue stream, but it's also a little bit of a challenge in terms of nitrogen management, because that balance between the cost of the inputs and the value of the crop is very strongly weighted towards inputs. But we do have an opportunity to further diversify our cropping systems and reintroduce perennial cropping into our region. We've changed a lot of our perennial cropping to annual cropping, and we might have some opportunities to revert back to that, more perennial cropping based systems. And again, the availability of these other organic amendments, manure, composts, and biosolids, all have important opportunities, not only for building soil organic matter, but also for increasing the soil nitrogen supply. As I said, I've spent the last couple of decades working on this within the region, and one of the things that I've come up with, or we've come up with many of my coworkers, Bjorn Zebarth, John McLeod, Judith Nirniza, among others, is we've tried to come up with a system where we actually can have tools that will allow us to measure the state of nitrogen within our soils and use that for planning purposes. This is a system that I'm going to talk a little bit about. I'm going to talk about various parts of it, but basically it's an attempt to quantify the soil nitrogen, the mineralization that's occurring within the system, looking at the opportunities for using 4R fertilizer management to increase the efficiency of nitrogen use within the system, and monitoring where nitrogen goes in the fall in terms of crop yield, but also how much nitrate is remaining in the soil following harvest, and because that has a very high potential for loss in our region. And are there some tools we can use to control that post-harvest nitrogen management? And so again, the focus of this has been measurable tests, like the kind of tests I talked about in the first week, interpreting them within the context of the climatic constraints of our region, and then using that as a way of informing an improved fertilizer management strategy. So 4 things I want to talk about today. How much nitrogen are we currently using, just so we can get a sense? How much is enough? How do we determine the right rate? How well are we quantifying our inputs, and how can we improve that? And also, how are we managing our losses? Like most of North American agriculture, in fact, much of the agriculture in the Western world, nitrogen fertilizer use has been increasing dramatically over the last 3-4 decades. You will see one of the interesting things about Atlantic Canada is there's quite a bit of variability from year to year in nitrogen use, and that has a lot to do with the cost of the nitrogen and also some of the growing conditions that exist. But there is an upward trend for increasing nitrogen fertilizer use in Atlantic Canada. This looks at the various sources of nitrogen to the various provinces in Atlantic Canada. The blue line is the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, orange is manure, and both manure and the gray is manure deposited directly on pasture, in other words, not managed manure. And then the other one is soil nitrogen mineralization and biosolids. You can see that, at least in New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, synthetic nitrogen is the dominant source of nitrogen added to the system, largely related to potato production. I will also note that Newfoundland is quite different. Their major sources of nitrogen are related to manure and or organic amendments that are available in their system from either from the sea or from from the farm. The land receiving fertilizer has not been increasing, so we're increasing fertilizer use, but if anything, we're slightly decreasing the land to which we're applying fertilizer to. So that's implying that you're using higher and higher rates of nitrogen fertilizer. What types of nitrogen fertilizer do we use? Here's another way in which Atlantic Canada is quite unique. If I were talking about Canada in general, I'd be talking about urea as a dominant source, or urea ammonium nitrate. In Prairie Canada, I might talk about anhydrous ammonia, which is commonly used. But in Atlantic Canada, most of our, at least from the National Inventory reported, most of our nitrogen sources are other. And that's been historically our reliance on ammonium nitrate or ammonium nitrate-like products, or diammonium phosphate or monoammonium phosphate. So we're a little bit challenged, and we're using those other types of nitrogen sources that don't necessarily receive the same kind of research that urea or anhydrous ammonia have received. Although there is an increasing trend to using urea within the region. So we're becoming a little bit more like the rest of Canada with time. So how much nitrogen is enough? That's what I want to talk about now. That's how much we use, but how much is enough? Many years ago, as part of the greenhouse gas taking charge team in the early 2000s, we tried to assemble a fact sheet that says, how can we actually decide how to determine a rate recommendation? And this is specifically for potato, but it also applies to other crops as well. And that's the New Brunswick Soil and Crop Association published this fact sheet. And it's available. I think PEI also published basically the same fact sheet in their system too. And it talks about a systematic way in which we can calculate a nitrogen requirement, give credit for various sources, calculate the fertilizer recommendation, and apply for our principles. And all those concepts still apply. So I would recommend you have a look at this fact sheet, because it's good background material, but we can do better now. One of the things that was challenging is that in that fact sheet, and again, this is for potatoes, they said, well, what should be our recommended rate for nitrogen application? And that was a discussion in a room, people having various perspectives and coming to a consensus, but it wasn't primarily data-driven. It was primarily experientially driven. And so it causes us to say, well, how do we know that these are the right numbers? And how does that relate to your farm and your soil conditions and your cropping practices? And that's a major uncertainty in the whole nitrogen management focus. I talked about this last week, or 2 weeks ago, when I talked about soil testing. I said that for soil testing to be valid, it has to be calibrated with in-field, regionally representative response trials. Same is true for nitrogen fertilizer. And that's one of our weaknesses, is we haven't been doing a lot of nitrogen response trials using modern varieties and modern practices within the Atlantic region, because they're expensive to do. And I talked about an in-field calibration approach that you could do within your field. And I think that's where we're going. But I think that's one of the things that adds uncertainty to our nitrogen management within the region. I also want to talk about what should be your goal in nitrogen management, because oftentimes we sort of, without thinking, we sort of say, well, obviously I want to target a yield that's a little bit better than last year's. I want to go for a maximum yield because that's my maximum productivity, and that's where life will be good. But that's not the case. I'm going to try to convince you of otherwise. So here, the couple things I want to emphasize here is, as we increase the nitrogen application rate, at first the increase in yield, this is the nitrogen content of the yield, goes up quite quickly, but then it starts to slow down. It doesn't go up as quickly, and it plateaus at maximum yield. We have to reflect that in the blue here, we have the fertilizer we had to add to achieve that yield, and that's linear. And one of the important things to note is, at some point, the cost of fertilizer is not offset by the increased value of the yield. And therefore, our goal should not be maximum profit or maximum yield. It should be maximum profit. And the other reason why I say that is, if in gray here we have the environmental impact of nitrogen use, and we see it's curvilinear the other way. So we have our greatest impacts where we're at or above the level at which the crop is responding to the nitrogen we add. So this is a real danger zone where we're not making any more money from that nitrogen, but we're having more environmental impact. Let me get this out of the way. Okay. So at the beginning of agriculture, a century or so ago, we used to farm way down here because we didn't have nitrogen fertilizers. We didn't have a lot of nitrogen inputs. We were producing very marginal yields because we had little ability to control the nutrient cycle. Now we're up here. We're going for those maximum yields to try to really push that system, but we're also having our maximum environmental impact. I'm arguing we need to be somewhere in the middle, where we're designing our system to maximize profit and maximize the nutrient use efficiency, and that's what the program that I'm talking about is aimed at. So, not maximum yield, but maximum profit should be our goal. And here's an example for Ontario grain production. This is a nitrogen response trial from data collected at LOR over about 30 years. Maximum yield was about 170 kilograms of N per hectare, but maximum profit was more like 140. And that becomes particularly important when the price of nitrogen changes. And one of the things that's really concerned me about the media lately, we hear about increasing nitrogen rates, and I hear quotes from farmers and other people within the ag sector saying, "Oh dear, with the nitrogen price this year, I'm going to have to spend so much on nitrogen, it's going to eliminate my profit." Or we cannot sacrifice yield or cannot sacrifice short on nitrogen because it'll negatively affect our profit. Not necessarily. When the price of nitrogen goes up, the economic rate of nitrogen use necessarily goes down. And I've tried to plot that here. So this I've used as just sort of a reference. The value of nitrogen this is from the US, so it doesn't include shipping charges and all that sort of thing. So you can't go by these exact values. But as the price of nitrogen roughly doubles, the recommended rate goes from about 170 down to about 140. Okay, so in the face of increasing nitrogen cost, our first response should be to use less to maximize profit. We should not be using the same amount of nitrogen to maximize yield. And that's a really important concept that I think underlies any strategy to try to improve the efficiency of nitrogen use. Your goal should be to maximize your profit. So how do we do that? Well, unfortunately, within this region, we don't have a lot of good tools. Here's one that the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Food have developed there. It's called their Maximum Economic Rate Nitrogen Calculator. And they consider a number of different things. First of all, they have to use a proven yield or a realistic yield. They adjust it for their environmental conditions to reflect that yield potential. They look at the previous crop that's been grown. Then they enter the expected price of corn and the cost of the inputs. And that's how their economic optimum comes in. So it's not a provincially, like one of the things that frustrates me is in the region, we've used the same recommended rate for decades. Even when the value of the product and the value of the cost of the fertilizer has fluctuated wildly, we're still saying we should be using the same rate of nitrogen. That's not the case. The rate of nitrogen should reflect the cost of nitrogen relative to the value of the yield. Okay, so that's my how much is enough. How well are we quantifying the various sources of nitrogen that are occurring within our system? Well, too often we want to think of this very simplistically and say, well, the only thing I can really measure is how much nitrogen I put on the system and how much grain I took off. So I'm going to define the nitrogen use efficiency as the crop harvested over the fertilizer added, and I'll come up with some number like 60 or 70% and feel pretty good. The reality is only half that nitrogen came from the actual fertilizer. The other half came from the soil. And so really what we should be doing is we should be, if we're trying to estimate our nitrogen use efficiency, we should be dividing the crop harvested by all the various end sources. And that dramatically drops that nitrogen use efficiency, but it shows us the real issue that we're trying to tackle. And so the more naive view of only thinking about the fertilizer is not allowing us to achieve the kind of efficiencies that we should be able to achieve. And that's why, in part, in this, one of the recommendations in this, Jimmy, quiet. Sorry about that. I apologize. Jimmy had to become part. One of the recommendations. Hold on. One moment. I'm sorry. My apologies. So one of the things that we incorporated in that recommendation guide a number of years ago was this way in which we could systematically quantify the credit for various sources of nitrogen other than simply the fertilizer. And that's an important thing to look at. And again, that's detailed in much more detail in that procedure. So again, so if we look at, for example, potato crop, if we have a yield goal of about 300 weight, the fertilizer end rate traditionally has been around 185, the crop removal about 90. That relieves a partial imbalance about 95 kilograms. So we're only about 49% efficient. But if we'd actually considered all the nitrogen sources, we end up being that efficiency is only about 33%. And that really focuses on where we can achieve some efficiency, maybe reevaluating that nitrogen rate, but also thinking about where this nitrogen, other nitrogen's going. Where's that residual nitrogen and how is that working? Matt Ramsey and the PEI Federation of Agriculture has embodied this kind of a concept, this nitrogen balance approach in their one of the tools they're using as part of their off-cast program, where they actually lead the producer through constructing a nitrogen balance based on the estimated crop removal, various credits, determining the nitrogen required, then fertilizer rates, and they also include within that an estimation of the efficiency of various ways of supplying that nitrogen. I would encourage you to check out that tool. It's really quite an innovative tool. So one of the things we've been trying to do is in this tool, you see this nitrogen supply is blank. We really don't have a very good way of converting, of quantifying nitrogen mineralization, or at least we didn't have one. And one of the things we've been working on is trying to develop that tool. In particular, what we do is we use this BNA test that the PEI lab offers as part of their soil health package, or we're also looking at the possibility of using the potentially mineralization number that the A&L labs reports as part of their soil health package as a way of estimating the mineralization of soil organic matter, contextualizing that in terms of the climate of the region to estimate a growing season nitrogen mineralization value. And here are the kinds of values we obtain. In this case, for PEI, mineralization rates of about 30-40 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare to up as much as 400. So order of magnitudes variations in nitrogen mineralization potential. The important things to note being the magnitude of difference that occurs within a single cropping system, reflecting management, things like the addition of manure or past nitrogen practices, the use of legumes or whatnot. But also the other part is this estimate of nitrogen mineralization is influenced by cropping system. So cropping systems that include hays and perennial forages are much higher than those that do not, in particular root crops, in this case potato, because of the decline in soil organic matter, has a lower mineralization potential. But understanding this and compensating for this in terms of our nitrogen management is one of the ways in which we can move towards greater efficiency. Here's similar data from a soil health survey in Nova Scotia. Again, similar ranges, even higher ranges in some cases, but the similar kind of variability within cropping systems and variability between cropping systems. And so this is information that we feel by implementing this test we can start to capture and bring into that quantitative assessment of the need for nitrogen, supplementary nitrogen fertilizer addition. Here's data from New Brunswick, fewer points, but again, same kind of trend. Higher rates under forage and pasture, lower rates under root crops and whatnot, which have a higher degree of disturbance. And in many cases will have higher or lower amounts of organic material addition through manures or crop residues. We haven't done this sort of a survey for Newfoundland, but some of the folks at Memorial have been doing research estimating nitrogen mineralization, and they come up with relatively similar numbers in the sort of 50, 60, 70s up to is 150, 160 kilograms per ton and per hectare. The important aspect of this is to realize there is a high potential for nitrogen supply being supplied by soil. How do we use that in estimating a nitrogen application rate? Well, there's a couple of problems with simply taking that number. These numbers are very large numbers. Right? So if we're mineralizing 400 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, does that mean 400 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare is available to the crop? No, for a couple of different reasons. One is we have some uncertainty in that estimate. Two, we have a period of time over which the crop is taking up nitrogen, and that is a shorter period of time than is the period of mineralization. So only part of that estimate of mineralization would be available to the crop, and also there's an inefficiency in the crop itself. So we have to consider those things, and we try to calculate or translate that estimate of total mineralization into plant available nitrogen or a nitrogen credit. And here's how we do that. Here's an example from Luke Lawrence's work in Prince Edward Island, where he took an estimate of growing season mineralization both based on the total nitrogen content of the soil and that measure of biological nitrogen availability. That estimate came out to 115 to 120, depending on the fields he was looking at, 164 in this case. But he used a risk factor to reflect the uncertainty in the estimate. What percentage of that mineralization period is actually coexists with the ability of the plant to take up nitrogen? In this case, only 60% of the time, and an estimated nitrogen use efficiency of 50%. And he came up with a credit of about 28 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So that 115 translates down to 128 or to 28. But that's an amount we could subtract from our fertilizer requirement in that nitrogen balance calculation that the PEI Federation. In this case, here we have an example where the number's 90, that the credit becomes 90, and it can be reflected in that overall nitrogen balance and be used to adjust the nitrogen requirements for that crop to increase the efficiency of nitrogen utilization. Okay, that's how we can quantify nitrogen inputs. How do we manage losses? So the losses we're talking about are varied. Ammonia volatilization comes up from the soil surface, is influenced by the addition of ammonium-containing nitrogen compounds to the soil surface, urea or liquid manure. Denitrification occurs within the soil and occurs under anaerobic conditions, and nitrate occurs as a result of the movement of water throughout the soil. So we have a couple of different things we have to try to manage. One of the approaches that's been used to do this is what's called 4R nutrient stewardship. And it applies both to phosphorus as well as nitrogen, but I'm going to talk about the nitrogen elements at this point. So it looks at the placement of fertilizer, the rate of fertilizer addition, the timing of fertilizer addition, and the source of fertilizer addition as ways of influencing that soil nitrogen supply. I've added right rotation because that's also something. It's not a fertilizer-based R, but it is an R that exists within your management system that should also be considered. So what that does is it influences soil nitrogen supply. We have an experimental measure we use called nitrate exposure to see the vulnerability of nitrate to loss, because You'll note that other than ammonia volatilization, both of these loss pathways are influenced by how much nitrate persists in the soil. So this nitrate exposure measure is a measure of how much nitrate persists in the soil. And we also use a measure of crop yield to determine how efficient we were at taking up that nitrogen. So the 4R framework builds on fundamental scientific principles, and that's why I really like that program. It uses good solid science, but it also results in practical choices that you can be implemented on the farm. So it's a nice bridge between the science and the practice of nitrogen management. In Atlantic Canada, here are some of our challenges. A short and variable growing season, well, that means we need to focus on the right time of nitrogen fertilizer application to ensure that we're hitting that period of most rapid nitrogen uptake. Soil pH, the right product using limestone. We talked about that last week. Adding limestone increases the efficiency of nitrogen use by altering some of the nitrogen processes that occur in the soil, like nitrogen fixation, nitrogen mineralization. Low base saturation, and this is more related to calcium and magnesium, but again, the right product, limestone. Declining soil organic matter, here's where right rotation comes in. Diversifying our rotations, increasing the use of perennials will build soil organic matter and build the nitrogen supplying capacity of the soil such that we are able to rely less on that supplemental nitrogen added. No nitrogen test, that gives us uncertainty. And that's one of the things we've addressed by introducing this test of nitrogen mineralization potential. The vulnerability to surface and groundwater, right place. Avoid surface application to avoid runoff. Also, in terms of, I could have added atmospheric impacts, avoid leaving urea on the surface to minimize ammonia volatilization losses. And this limited farm calibration of nitrogen responses, we talked a little bit last day or 2 days in the first session about on-farm calibration as a way of better understanding to what extent your crop is going to respond to nitrogen. I'm going to use a couple of specific examples. So one of the real goals in increasing the efficiency of nitrogen management is that we want to ensure that the nitrogen becomes available when the plant is able to take it up. And it's important to remember for most crops, from the time of seeding to the time of actually rapid nitrogen uptake is several weeks, 4 to 6 weeks. So there's a period of time that the crop really isn't, the roots aren't developed well enough. It's really not capable it's really not capable to take that nitrogen up. Therefore, there's a risk of nitrogen loss. The nitrate, or particularly nitrate, is sitting in the soil, can be lost as a result of high rainfall because the crop's not taking it up. There's also, that's true in the fall. Once the crop has senesced, it's stopped taking up nitrogen. It's just translocating nitrogen around within the plant. And so any nitrogen that accumulates during that period is also at risk of loss. So what we want to do is we want to minimize how much nitrate accumulates in these 2 red periods and increase the amount that occurs in this green period, because that's the nitrogen that the crop can see. And that's a lot of what 4R is about, is it's trying to use various kinds of practices to make sure that we're hitting that window of opportunity, that where nitrate is only appearing when the plant can take it up. We can do that through timing, choice of a product, placement of the product, those sorts of things. And again, here's the same, we're saying the same sort of thing. We're trying to avoid this potential for loss by improving the timing of nitrogen availability, and we can do that through split applications of nitrogen, at least in some crops. So rather than putting all of the nitrogen up front, so it's sitting there for that 4 to 6 weeks when the crop's not taking it up, we can put a little bit on to get it started, but then come a little bit later on to apply nitrogen closer to the time when the crop can actually use it. We're also seeing increased use of foliar applications where we actually apply the nitrogen in crop to the leaves as the crop needs it. And that can be done through a field sprayer, but also is being done as part of irrigation systems through fertigation. The other approach we are using as part of the 4R approach is delaying the process of nitrification. Nitrification is the conversion of ammonium to nitrate. Nitrate is the form that's most susceptible to loss via denitrification or nitrate leaching. So if we can delay the accumulation of nitrate in the soil, ammonium, a cation, is less mobile in the soil, still somewhat mobile because our soils have such low cation exchange capacity, but it's less mobile than the nitrate. So if we can delay nitrification till that green period of optimum plant nitrogen uptake, we can increase nitrogen use efficiency. So there's a number of different products that can do that. Inhibitors, the use of slow release or coated products, and it used to be we talked a lot more about the banding of urea, which also inhibits nitrification. So some of these inhibitors, we talk about really two primarily inhibitors, a urease inhibitor and a nitrification inhibitor. Or we'll talk about a dual urease and nitrification inhibitor. And one of the absolutely critical things that we need to be aware of is that, for example, the urease inhibitor is only effective if urea is the nitrogen source. Whoops. If urea is the nitrogen source. The ammonium inhibitor, the nitrification inhibitor, inhibits the conversion of ammonium to nitrate. So it's actually effective on any ammonium-based source or any source that produces ammonium. So if we're using urea, a dual inhibitor can be beneficial. But if we're using ammonium-based source like ammonium anhydrous ammonia, there's absolutely no use of providing a urease inhibitor. It'll have no effect. Similarly, if we're using a nitrate-based fertilizer like calcium nitrate, none of these inhibitors are of any value. And so it's really important that if we're considering using an inhibitor, we have to be using it with the right form of nitrogen and to block the right sort of nitrogen loss. So a urease inhibitor primarily will influence the potential for ammonia loss. So if I was applying urea on the surface and unable to incorporate, leaving it on the soil surface, the addition of a urease inhibitor would prevent that urea from turning to the ammonium form, which can be lost, and allow the urea, which is quite water soluble, to be washed into the soil with rainfall. And so that would be a beneficial way of reducing ammonia loss, which can be very significant. In terms of a nitrification inhibitor, now we're talking about processes within the soil and the delay of nitrate formation. So it's a little bit better at an overall reduction in nitrate accumulation. And the data we have is primarily on N2O emissions because that's one of the easiest ones to measure. But it reflects also the potential general loss. But we can get reductions in these losses of 20 to 30 to 40% as a result of using these inhibitors. Now, by reducing those losses, we're going to increase the efficiency of nitrogen, allowing us to apply less to achieve the same yield. Again, we've already talked a little bit about rate. We need to quantify all our end sources, including organic amendments, including legumes, and adjust our rates to reflect both the cost of the nitrogen, but also the use of an inhibitor or something to increase the efficiency of nitrogen. One of the things I'm often asked is if I'm using a dual inhibited product, it's just going to cost me more. Well, no, because it's more efficient, you should be using less. And so it may actually be a better approach to buy the same amount of nitrogen as you used to, use the same dollar value in buying your inhibited product, just buy less of it. So it's costing you the same, but you're using less nitrogen. Or in some of our studies in PEI, you can actually buy less. So you can actually save money by using that inhibited product. Right place. Oftentimes, when I talk next week about phosphorus, we're going to talk about phosphorus placement because it's so poorly mobile in soil, but nitrate is quite mobile. So when we talk about right place in nitrogen, we're usually talking about putting it in the soil to avoid volatilization of urea. That's one example of right place. But the other way we're talking about placement now is variability within the landscape, because the nitrogen production potential of the soil varies within the landscape. Not the nitrogen, sorry. The crop production potential varies within the landscape, and therefore the nitrogen demand varies within the landscape. Also, the potential for loss varies within the landscape. So we can use relatively complex algorithms to try to say where in the landscape are we going to get our best efficiency, our best use of our nitrogen? Where should we be putting more nitrogen? Where should we be putting less? and so we're overall increasing that efficiency. It won't necessarily decrease the total amount of nitrogen you use. It may just redistribute it within the landscape so it's being placed where it can be most efficiently used. Right rotation. Well, here's where we're talking a lot more about the use of legumes. The use of legumes benefits in a couple of different ways. Obviously, they manifest nitrogen fixation, and therefore they do not require as much nitrogen fertilizer. But secondarily, oftentimes their crop residues are nitrogen rich and can supply the next crop, particularly if they're used as part of a cover crop. Increasingly, we also can look at other types of cropping systems, use of cover crops to recover some of that nitrate that exists in the soil in the fall after harvest. One of the unfortunate things about the Atlantic region is that there's nitrate in the soil after harvest, it's almost surely going to be lost over winter. So it's a loss to the system. If we can use a cover crop to sequester or take up some of that nitrogen, it could then be carried over to the next year and provide nitrogen to the subsequent crop. Perennial crops, one of the important things they do is build soil organic matter. And as I showed you earlier, as you increase the amount of perennial crop, as you decrease soil disturbance, the nitrogen mineralization potential of the soil goes up. Therefore, there's less requirement for supplemental nitrogen. In terms of managing the nitrogen we did not use, and that's where we're advocating the measurement of nitrate remaining in the soil after harvest, there is the opportunity to use cover crops or high C/N ratio soil amendments to immobilize that nitrogen so it does not get lost over a winter period. It can be a bit of a challenge in that we often are harvesting our crops late in the season and there's not much opportunity for cover crops, but there's some really innovative work that's been going on in Prince Edward Island to look at what opportunities they are and how we can best utilize that. Remember, a cover crop, or at least a fall planted cover crop, is not primarily about generating a crop for harvest. It's about immobilizing the nitrogen for the next year's crop. So it's really the goals in terms of that crop are much more about nitrogen use efficiency than they are about producing a harvestable grain. And that's, and that because I've seen people be implementing cover crops and then heavily fertilizing them. That defeats the purpose. We're trying to sequester and immobilize nitrogen. I want to highlight some of Judith Nirniza's work. She's been looking at the use of cover crops to immobilize nitrogen and as a way of building soil health. And there's some really innovative and encouraging work going on there. One of the things that she's shown is the kind of nitrogen contribution, the average nitrogen contribution to potato as a result of using the various cover crops, and shows that they differ depending on the degree to which a legume has been included in the system. Again, this is better providing information on the quantification of those legume credits. We have this sort of notional concept of what a legume credit should be. We need better data to support that work. And what Judith's work suggested is that the nitrogen supplying capacity from nitrogen mineralization was something a little over 100, which is matches well with what we've been measuring with the BNA test. But then a legume credit was more like 31 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, which is a little bit larger than the typical nitrogen legume credit we often use. And again, this is the similar data we're finding for our test. Our mean was around 108, and about 30 more for the systems that included legumes. So that's primarily what I wanted to talk about today. We talked about how much nitrogen we currently use within the region and what kind of nitrogen we use. How do we decide how much what should be enough? What should be our target in terms of yield? How do we quantify those nitrogen inputs other than fertilizer that are hard to quantify? And what kinds of practices can we use in terms of managing losses? Mostly looking at 4 Rs plus crop rotation. And in terms of nitrogen improvement, one of the things we can do is increase the use of soil nitrogen testing, nitrogen mineralization testing. Hopefully advocate for better crop nitrogen response data. In the potato world, we have that sort of data, but for many of the other crops in the region, we don't have as nearly as good a crop nitrogen response data as we need. More effective implementation of 4R and N management, and that's what OFCAF is all about. Improving our understanding of these nitrogen legume credits. Again, Judith's work has been doing excellent work in that regard. Improved crediting of manure and other organic amendments. That's another area where we don't really have enough regional data to understand how do we translate particularly the organic nitrogen content of manure into a soil nitrogen supply rate. And improve fall nitrogen management through cover crops. We have this risk of any nitrate that remains in our soil in the fall has the high potential of being lost. So anything we can do to recover that and trap it and provide to the next crop is going to be really beneficial. So I'm going to end there and ask if there's any questions. I will highlight again the Farm Learning Hub. We have put together a nitrogen management section within that, and there's a lot of useful lectures on various details of 4R practices. And there's also an opportunity for mentorship with farmers who have already implemented these practices and their successes and their failures. And again, here's the thing you need to scan to get credits for this session. So, Gabrielle, I'll stop there if you want to. Maybe I'll stop sharing so you can actually see me.
There is one question in your chat. Zosia is asking.
Okay, let me.
Is there a link to download the Ontario Corn Management Sheet, nitrogen sheet?
Yes, I think if you just Google OMAF MERN calculator, maximum economic return to nitrogen is what MERN stands for. If you Google that, it'll take you right to it. Oh, sorry, I want the QR code. Yep, we can do it. There, you should be seeing it. What do I know about polymer-coated fertilizers and microplastic concerns? Okay, so polymer, I should have spent more time talking about polymer-coated, particularly polymer-coated urea. So the way it slows urea release is by restricting water movement in to dissolve the urea and make available to the soil. So with time, the polymer coating allows that water to go in, it dissolves the urea, it makes its way into soil, and then the urease and the other enzymes can act upon it. One of the challenges with that is it relies upon water. So if we have a very dry spring, there'll be an even further delay in the availability of that nitrogen. And that can be a little bit of a concern. Another concern is that it requires the integrity of that prill to be maintained. So if handled roughly, those polymer coatings can crack and therefore they can alter the rate of release. But you also questioned about the whole issue of microplastics, and this has been highlighted. One perspective on this is that it's a relatively small amount of plastic. Another perspective is maybe we don't need to use plastic. And I think the fertilizer industry is working very hard to look at biodegradable coatings as opposed to the typical plastic coating. So it's a concern. I don't know whether I can provide any insight as to whether it's a significant concern or not. But I know it's something the industry has heard about and are working to address. Any other questions?
I've got a question, Dave. For
Sure.
farmers who are using like alfalfa or like a very high population, like an 80-20 legume to grass mix, do you have any comments on how they should be fertilizing with nitrogen in those? Because I know they make their own, but should we be doing more nitrogen in the first year and then laying off more in the following years of the rotation? What do you think there?
Well, if you fertilize it with nitrogen, you're going to suppress nitrogen fixation. So I would perhaps maybe a little bit of a starter fertilizer. I don't know, like a DAP or something, but I would suggest no nitrogen in alfalfa. Because again, if the plant's smart, if there's a easily available nitrogen source like nitrate, it'll use that and shut down fixation. Why spend all the energy to fix nitrogen if you're getting it free? And so I would be hard pressed to figure out why you'd be putting nitrogen fertilizer on a productive legume like alfalfa. And I'm not sure whether it would actually enhance establishment, in that the competitive advantage of the alfalfa is that it is nitrogen fixing. If you're putting nitrogen there, you might actually just encourage the weeds, or not the weeds, the competing crops more than the alfalfa. So I guess I'm wondering why you put nitrogen fertilizer on clover or alfalfa. Phosphorus, different story. We'll talk about that next week.
Great promotion, Dave. No, that's a great answer. Thanks.
Okay, well,
Dave,
stop sharing.
Dave Walker here.
Hey, Dave, how you doing?
Great. I was in the process of typing out a question, but I figured you might end it before I finished it. But anyway, it's the question is regarding nitrogen applications on second and possibly third cuts of forages. Given that period is usually kind of like mid to late June through to maybe even the end of August, that is when the greatest, the soils are warm. And if you have adequate moisture, you should have, a strong mineralization of nitrogen. And therefore, I'm just wondering, just to kind of discuss the benefits of putting nitrogen on crops for that second and third cuts of forages, because if there's ever going to be a mineralization of nitrogen, it's during those, that when the soils are warm and hopefully there's adequate moisture there to increase that biological activity so that the nitrogen is produced. So anyway, just a discussion.
Excellent question, and I think this is where using the mineralization test would be really important. So if your field is one of those ones that because of past manure application, or it's been a long time in perennial, the mineralization potential is really high, I probably would say that mineralization potential is going to be sufficient to push those second and third cuts just fine, no problem. However, if you're in a situation where this field has a low organic matter content and a low mineralization potential, that might be a key time where you would use something like a nitrate-based fertilizers that would quickly would not be susceptible to ammonia loss, would quickly move into the soil and feed that crop, because it is a warm period of active nitrogen uptake by the crop. You don't want to delay nitrogen availability in that situation because the crop's ready for it. It wants it. But the question is how much nitrogen mineralization is occurring in your system, and that we can only really determine by measurement. You saw there's an order of magnitude difference between these. Some were like 20 kilograms of N per hectare and some were 200. Well, don't put the nitrogen on the 200, but do put it on the 20. Make sense?
I'm thinking that Dave should have identified the forage stand. Like, is it a legume? Or are you talking?
Oh,
grass?
that's a excellent point. Excellent point. I was assuming a predominantly grass-based stand. If it's a legume, if there's a significant amount of legume, then just as I suggest to Gabrielle, I would not put very much, if any, nitrogen on it. In particular, because we're also learning that legumes share nitrogen with grasses, so that legume also provides something to the timothy or any other grass that's in that system. But good point, Ray. My comments were more a heavily grass-based system.
And your comments were in line with my question, and I should have, as Ray indicated, I should have outlined it a little more clearly. I was thinking mainly in a grass rotation, and if you're producing forages, then you're going to be producing manure on the farm, and assumably some of that manure is going to go on that forage field. And so I'm thinking maybe we might be over applying nitrogen for that second and third cuts, given the mineralization from those soils? Just a kind of discussions.
Well, yeah. Let me pull up one of these charts that I was showing you, because I think it nicely illustrates this point. Are you guys? Am I sharing that? No, hold on. I'm not sure what you're seeing. I think I've messed everything up. Hold on.
We don't see your screen right now.
Let me just get the right slide up here first, and I'll share because it nicely illustrates this point. Okay, are you seeing? Oh, you're not seeing the presenter view, but that's fine. I'll make this a bit bigger. So this is data for New Brunswick, Dave. And so if you look at that forage hay pasture system, something like 80, something like 450, 460, all under the same management system, right? So if we're not measuring it, if we're not testing it, I can't, you should manage this one differently than this one, that's for sure. So the one that's at 450 probably doesn't need any nitrogen. It's probably had a lot of manure in the past, probably a lot of legume in that forage. Whereas the one that's like 80 has probably had far less, and so it should be managed quite differently. And that's why we're really saying we need to measure the soil to make these decisions. There isn't sort of a general cropping system recommendation we can make. It's a large part of it depends on the soil, its organic matter content. I'll stop sharing. Okay. Oh.
Yes, hello.
There's another question.
Yes.
Hi, how are you doing?
Hello. Can you please come back to this graph and the calculation of and the relationship between the price of nitrogen fertilizer and the nitrogen economic rate, please?
Yes, let me share that.
Thank you.
That one. Are you seeing it?
Yes, thank you.
So the point is here for a fixed grain price. Now, obviously, as grain prices, now one of the things that has historically happened is as nitrogen prices increases, grain prices have tended to increase. I'm not sure that's currently what's happening. I think it's going the opposite way. But as the cost of the inputs increase, the maximum economic rate, not the maximum yield, the maximum economic rate of nitrogen declines. And so here I plotted as a function of the price of the fertilizer. So as the fertilizer gets more expensive, the maximum economic rate becomes less. And don't go by the absolute numbers here, because I just took this, actually, this is a recent article in the Globe and Mail. I took this, I actually have found it very difficult to get a plot of the price of nitrogen over time for Atlantic Canada. There's some talk about the price of fertilizer, but it doesn't specify particularly nitrogen-based fertilizer. So it's really hard for me to find out how nitrogen costs have changed over time. But this is the data I could get. It's dollars per short ton in the U.S. dollars per short ton. So then I'm sure there's transportation costs and all kinds of things. I translated into Canadian dollars per kilogram or per pound of nitrogen.
So, Dave, economic nitrogen rate, it's for your optimal yield. Huh?
No, it's for your most profitable yield.
Yeah, most profitable yield. Okay.
Because again, maximum yield and profitable yield are two separate concepts. And that's the point I'm trying to get across.
Right.
We've been talking a little bit about something called profit first nitrogen. where we say, instead of saying, gee, I'm going to fertilize and manage all this crop and hope I make something at the end, I'm trying to say I'm going to manage such that I can maintain my profit, if at all possible. There's lots of unpredictable things, but at least my goal should be to sustain my profit rather than to achieve some sort of maximum yield. Okay, there's another question. Charles.
Thank you.
Dave, on the table showing the nitrogen management in PEI, there are adjustment coefficients. I remember 0.8, 0.6. Do you know how those coefficients have been determined?
Yes, I can explain those. Let me go to that slide.
Thank you.
So that was work that Luke Lawrence did as part of his. Where are we here? There, you should be seeing it. So you'll note this says tier 3. There was a tier 1 and tier 2, and the tier 1 was we generated a provincial map of nitrogen mineralization for all of the agricultural soils in Prince Edward Island using a pedotransfer function. Well, that had certainly a fairly high degree of uncertainty. Then the tier 2 is when we only had the standard S3 package for PEI, but we could predict nitrogen mineralization from that S3 package. That had less uncertainty than the general map, but more uncertainty than an actual measurement of BNA and total nitrogen. So this is the most, this is the highest degree of certainty, and we've calculated that by Luke used a machine learning approach, and part of that machine learning approach, it's like a huge correlation. And what it does is it actually assesses how, it's kind of like the R squared. It assesses how uncertain the prediction is, how much of the central trend is described by the variables. And it turns out when we measure actual mineralization potential and the total nitrogen content of the soil, we have a fairly high degree of confidence, 80%. So we said we would discount the number to reflect our 20% lack of confidence, if you will. Whereas for the other tiers, we had higher discount factors. So that comes from the certainty of the prediction tool. This active growing season adjustment is we predicted nitrogen mineralization over a 130-day growing period. Well, it turns out that the crop we were looking at in this case, potatoes, only is taking up nitrogen for about, I think, 70 or 90 days of that period. So we divided the 70 days it was taking up by 130 to get that 0.6 coefficient. So only 60% of that total growing season mineralization is available to the crop. So we discounted that 115 number to reflect the fact that there is a shorter period of active uptake. You'll notice in the forage, we gave it 100% because it's actively growing over the entire period. And then finally, we use the nitrogen use efficiency. A lot of research has shown that nitrogen fertilizer use efficiency is really about 50%. So we just use 50%. I suspect mineralized nitrogen can be used more efficiently, but I don't have data to support that, or don't have enough data to support that. So we used a very conservative 50%. So we applied each of these factors. We multiplied 115 by 0.8, and then by 1.6 or 0.6, and then by 0.5 to get the number 28. I think that's very conservative. I think that's an underestimate, but I'm a little bit more comfortable underestimating and such that people are willing to try this approach out. With time, as we get more data, we'll adjust these factors. Perhaps our confidence will increase. This is probably fixed because it reflects the actual physiology of the crop, but I'm quite certain our nitrogen use efficiency for nitrogen mineralization will increase with time as we gain greater confidence and greater data to support that efficiency. Does that help at all?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay, John's put me a link in here. Let me have a look at this link. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, but is it for Atlantic region? I don't know whether it's Atlantic province, territory, Canada. We say I can do the. This is good. This is good. I have not seen this.
Go, John. That's me, John, by the way.
Oh, well, I'll have to. Excellent. Thank you for this. This is very interesting. I had not seen that before. And this is from who? This is the old Kenson. Thank you very much for that, John. That was the data I was looking for, and I could not find. I'll have a better graph next time. But we also need prices. Anyway, that gives me a place to start. Thanks so much, John.
Well, David, I don't see or hear any more questions or hands up, so I just want to thank you for your excellent presentation today, and we look forward to the phosphorus one next week.
Okay, excellent. Phosphorus next week. That'll be very different, but just as much fun. Okay. Take care, everyone.